Ladies and gentlemen, that's working. Look at that. Everyone looked at me. Mr. Spalding, how we doing? We're going to get started in a moment. If you could find a seat that is comfortable. It's really nice to see everyone. And it was unfortunate we had to postpone the November 15th. Anytime you change dates on people, you tend to lose some that were planning on attending, but it's nice that you were able to rearrange your schedule and be here, especially during the holiday season, when we know there's very few evenings in December to do all it is that you need to get done. So thanks for coming out. I know most of you know me, Scott Nichols, Superintendent of Schools. Tonight is the second of 3 public workshops designed to kind of let this facility study move forward. I think all of you had a little bit of an opportunity to take a look at what is current, some of the various approaches in concept up here as to how we can proceed, and then also some enrollment projections and demographics over there. All of this is going to be covered in the presentation, and there'll be ample opportunity for all of you to ask questions and provide input. And if you don't want to ask your questions in this forum, and you feel more comfortable digesting some of this information and actually going back to local live, which this is going to be recorded, okay? You can rewatch it through, and notice it's just one camera, so it's an easier presentation to follow on local live than it was at the first one, right? So you'll be able to go back, you can watch it, you can tell your friends to watch it. We'll actually send it out again several times so people can get a sense of things. And then if you want to email questions to me or call me or meet with me personally in regards to any of this here, that's what our job is. Okay, so multiple opportunities to do this. A couple things I wanted to say that could be good takeaways for you. When we looked at the enrollment projections from 5 to 10 years going out, and I think this is key, we didn't get just one study, we got 2 studies, okay? And you're going to get some more details on this, but one of the things that came out, doing this in a conservative way, so like taking into consideration if everything broke our way in the district over the next 5 to 10 years, what would it look like? And coming from those enrollment projections is no matter which way you cut it, we're going to have increased student enrollment from 200 to 500 students. 500, when you talk about that, that's an entire new school, okay? And it's going to impact all 3 elementary schools. It's going to impact all 3 schools in terms of being able to keep class sizes down and to have flexible class spaces. And so that's something that we're going to, as a school district in a town, have to work through this problem. There's a lot of opportunity with this, but it's something we're going to have to kind of think about and see what options we have. Because it's not going to be just a one project solution. Everyone in the last workshop really came out of that going, Wyndemere is an aging facility and something needs to be done with that. No question about it, right? Whether it's renovated or built to new, something has to be done with Wyndemere. It's an old building. That's not going to be the only solution to our challenge. So when you go through these different approaches and DRA kind of walks you through them and we start to think about them and you provide your input, that's going to help us figure out what the multi-project or multi-phases are going to be moving forward. We don't know what those are going to be, which is why you're here to provide all of that input, but this is what needs to be discussed. So those are really kind of 2 takeaways. Increased enrollment with aging facilities, multi-year, multi-projects of some sort. That's the problem of practice for the town of Ellington and the Ellington Public Schools. Okay? So I want to at this time introduce Jim Barrett from DRA, and we can move forward with some of the remainder of the program.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. And again, it's important in this early juncture along the way in this process for us to have the opportunity to have impact from our comment and issue brought to us from the citizenry. So very important to us to get that understanding. With me this evening, we have 4 of our members. Right in front of me, Paul Moore. He's worked with us in terms of demographics and educational planning. Off to the side, Greg Smalley, who will share in the presentation in terms of conveying some of this information. John Tyndall Gibson off to the side here, an ed planner programmer with DRA, looking at educational delivery. So as we get started this evening, it is all of the schools within the district that are being considered. It also includes the central office as one of the considered buildings to be maintained and considered as part of ongoing use within the district. In terms of the key issues that came to the table, first, increasing student enrollments. It's a bit of an anomaly. In most of the districts that we've worked with in the last 8 to 15 year window have really pointed to declining enrollments. Things are a bit different here within Ellington. We do have evidence of increasing student enrollments. Coupled with that, the 6 buildings in the study, we do have aging facilities. So they're well cared for. They often look great, but there is deferred maintenance along the way that builds over time. And in aging facilities, that's an issue to contend with. And then lastly, consideration of 21st century learning. Many of these buildings put in place 30, 40 years ago, and as such, built for educational delivery that may differ from what is attempted today within the classroom environment. In terms of our overall schedule, we started our work at the outset of September, and as we move through, we're right now at the beginning of December. Happy holidays. We've set a good amount of work in place in terms of coming to better understand Ellington, better understand the schools. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I'd like to emphasize we do have a long way to go. And that's something that this process will continue to build upon the information gathered. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to John to talk a little bit about what we learned in ed planning and programming.
Thank you, Jim. We've been collecting a lot of data. We've had 7 formal meetings with school officials and various other people throughout the community. We have done an email survey. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. We've been collecting documents. We had, as you know, a community workshop with over 100 people in it. We've inspected the buildings ourselves, and we've had our consultants go through the buildings, take notes, take photographs, talk to people in the buildings. And all of this data will be reported to you in the final report. 2 elements of that I want to talk about for just a second. One is the email survey, and the other is the community workshop. The email survey went out to all the employees in the district, over 300 people. We got 67 back. That's about a 20% return rate, which is pretty good for that kind of activity. And the responses came from mostly teachers, 46 teachers, but also other professional certified staff and cafeteria workers and so on. So at the community workshop, we heard from a lot of people. We have recorded comments from 59 different individuals. That data is relative to 4 things that we asked about that evening: the themes that are about education that are going on in the community, the facilities themselves, the instruction or what's going on inside of the facilities and about children. So this amounts to hundreds of recorded comments from a broad representation of the community: parents, teachers, students, administrators, town officials, school staff, and representatives from other key stakeholder groups. What we have learned is that we have a number of prevalent comments, and we'll put them up there on the slide if we can get somebody. There we go. And in terms of assets, one of the things that was mentioned very frequently was staff and children are assets, and that's not quite what we were asking people for. We were asking them more about educational things, but it's important to note that, you know, this is a community that values children and sees teachers as assets. The folks we heard from said that they're proud of the technology. There's a good bit of it in the schools. Schools are technology rich, and that's important. In spite of the fact that they're old buildings, they are clean, they are well-maintained, bright buildings, and a number of people commented they like access from the schools, from the classrooms to the outdoors, and plenty of natural light. In terms of challenges, lots of comments on just not enough classrooms. The classrooms that we have are old-fashioned, too small, dingy, not enough storage, and that's kind of spotty. In some places, classrooms are, you know, really great. Crystal Lake was mentioned by a number of people as a very nice facility with some real assets up there. Roofing issues, mostly at Wyndemere. No air conditioning was a very common complaint, and insufficient space for special programs, which are highly valued. And it seems like there are a number of programs that are being infringed upon because their space is being taken for other purposes. And so there are some opportunities that some kids are missing out on now. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm Greg Smalley with DRA. Working off of where John left us, existing conditions as we spent some time out here over the summer, there were a couple of items, some good, some bad, some look better than others. Overall, it's pretty easy to see, walk around the buildings, they look to be very well maintained. There's a lot of effort going into it, a lot of pride taken in the buildings, but at the same time, computer labs, very, very crowded, very hot when they're operating. A music room, well undersized for the amount of participation that's taking place. Single gym, you're sitting in it right now. For a high school, single gym's quite difficult to program and make work, plus the heating and cooling in this particular area is tough. And front door, there's the vestibule, there's the main entrance, there's a way in. So we start to look at security issues as well as we look at the buildings when we start moving through. Jump over to the elementary schools for a little while. Handicapped accessibility at the playgrounds is one of those issues that always comes up and always moves along, but is a true issue for every school. Music room at center school with a divider, sound transmission from one spot to the other makes it more difficult to use those adjoining rooms. Once again, security, there's a nice welcome sign, but I just walked in the front door and I'm in the building itself. Not ideal. And we have some roof issues at center school as we do at Wyndemere. So nice looking pieces of building, quite a bit of work that needs to go into them. It starts to form the foundation for some of the suggestions you'll see a little bit later on. So we wanted to come back after we understood the building somewhat and take a broader look. We started doing this at the first session that you might have attended. Looking a little bit more, this is your plan from the Plan of Community Development from '04 and then updated in the teens sometime. The telling piece here is those black lines and little squares are all houses, and the white land alongside of it is vacant or underdeveloped or undeveloped. So this is land that's not committed to residential, not committed to farming. It has the potential to be residential as you move forward. We've got Wyndemere down here, center there, Crystal Lake out there, and a bunch of building going on up here. Now right now, these are being served by Wyndemere and Center, but it starts to form some of our discussion of, as the town continues to grow, where might the schools need to be in order to best address that growth. Go ahead, Jim. So we wanted to know, is the growth real? As Scott had said, this is starting with U.S. Census from 2000 up through 18. 2018 is an actual demographic population, so from 12,000, 13,000 to 16,000 in the course of 8 years. You follow that projection out on a fairly straight line on births and move in, move out, and by 2040, we're at 22,000 people. So we're projecting somewhere about a 33% growth across the town in the next 20 years. And we look a little bit further at community trends, you see some of the discussion of types of buildings that are being built and the summary of projected students. So the more that we're building in new homes and planned detached multifamily are the places where we're getting the most students per residential unit. And as we talk with planners and the planning department, they're aware of that trend, they're aware of this trend. Our bottom line is the total number of children, and the upper line is the total number of houses. They reflect pretty closely, and that's all historical data. What it's telling us is that if we're looking at a 33% increase in the number of population across 20 years, the number of students is pretty much going to follow that. We look at 10-year projections for pre-K. Scott said earlier we've done 2 of those. The school district took on the NESDEC one, New England School Development Council. In all of the graphs you're going to see, they are the brown line. The projections we did are black. They were done by Education Resource Management. NESDEC is 1 year older than ours. So we baselined them at your current school population. That's why they start at the same point. And then they project out just slightly differently. So we wanted to move from where we were before to what we might start taking as a baseline for some discussion on, and we'll call these approaches. This is where anybody can make notes as you go along, leave notes with us later, talk to us when we're done, but here's a basic idea of how we might start to address this population. We're saying that in approach number 1, we're going to keep the current configuration. So we'll have 3 elementary schools, a middle school that's 7 and 8, and 9 through 12. We have the central office is 33% over capacity. That's a common through all of these options. We need to address the central office because though it's not a school, it's taking space from a school because the staff that would be in the central office is over in center school. So we're losing 1.5 classrooms from center school, effectively diminishing that capacity. We also use, as we go forward, the DAS guidelines at the Department of Administrative Services. That's a funding guideline. It's not an educational guideline. You will hear that more as we move from the next phases of this, of how the choices made by the towns impact the funding that's available from the state. We don't know of any towns right now that are following the DAS guidelines because they're indiscriminate. They say 25 kids in the classroom, whether it's pre-K or 12th grade. So it's just a funding guideline. We used it as a way to establish where the funding may fall out as we move through this. We have 3 utilization rates, and this is, you never use a school at 100% utilization because of population fluctuations and also the fact that they're kids, they're not widgets. You don't just pile them in and 25 fit in a classroom. So you need that flexibility. At an elementary school, we look for 90% utilization. So if the school has a capacity of 1,000, we'll look to put 900 kids in there as the utilization rate. Middle schools and high schools are 85% because the rooms start getting more and more specialized as you move along. So kind of a long introduction to keeping the schools where they are, adjusting the populations as they might grow, and then we see what happens now. So our green line right here is our desirable student population, the desirable capacity. The red line is the maximum capacity that the schools would like to see, and the purple line is the DAS guideline. So you'll see how indiscriminately DAS set that right there. The important part here is both NESDEC and ERM forecast that you're over capacity right now in a pre-K through 6 of the existing schools. No surprise there if you have a kid in the school or if you've been in the schools, you see what you're up against. Okay. Okay.
Quick second. You can bring that forward, Paul, to the next slide, the current configuration. So within the current configuration, to be able to modify to meet some of the needs at each of the buildings, it may require addition within a particular area to meet the additional square footage needs of a particular facility. in this case, in looking at it, if we could just take a look at the Ellington Middle School as an example, in that consideration within the approach that was just shared by Greg. Thank you, Brian. And that approach identified moving from a 7-8 model to a 6-8 middle school model. To accommodate that, a proposal of some additional space necessary for the middle school site. One thing that we'd like to emphasize in any of these test fits is simply that this is not meant to be architecture or planning, if you will. It's meant simply to be able to identify a need may exist and an opportunity in terms of how it might be addressed, but certainly not a solution necessarily to be considered moving forward. We'll get to those as we get deeper into the process. So we'll continue up top if that's good with you.
So as we move through these, you'll also see in the lower right hand of each one of the boards there, you'll see it up top also, is a relative comparison of cost. So we haven't assigned dollars to it, but one compared to the other, which is least expensive, which is projected to be most expensive. This approach, obviously, since it's maintaining the majority of the buildings, comes out as being the least expensive as a projected cost right now. So here we're talking grades 7 and 8 at the current middle school, our desired enrollment, the state enrollment, and the maximum enrollment. And by 2024, we're projecting even going above the state enrollment guidelines at the middle school. So tough building to work with, as we talked about earlier, and enrollments that start to exceed immediately. And then finally, the high school, which you'll see a few times. And Jim and I aren't on the same page. Let's go to high school. There you go. High school right now, the green line right there, as you get out into 23, 24, 24, 25, your NESDEC, if it's correct, will dip down into there, but right now you're trending above the capacity of the building, above the utilization rates, and you don't see much hope of coming down into that range of where you want to be with the high school. Feels like a big building. You walk around it, it takes a long time. Single level, fairly disjointed. It will feel big. It's not much bigger than what the guidelines would call for you to build, though. So we take approach 2, and at this level, we're saying, how can we start to free up some space here? We have a nice building here, a good site, a lot of fields, good community assets. What if we move the middle school into here and take it either 6-8 or 7-8 in this building, build a new high school, and build a new elementary school? And that takes us back into a little bit of the discussion we were having before about the growth in the town. So the new elementary school is starting to address that.
Just to touch on the configuration, what that would mean with the middle school moving up to the existing high school. Paul, if we can go to the configuration of the former middle school, please. It does mean that there's a resource in the community that has to be considered in terms of potential future use. Those future uses might include community uses, might include central office uses, might include parks and rec uses, et cetera. That is something that would have to be determined as we move forward, thinking about this as a potential option.
What you have here is the most expensive projected option. We're looking at building a new elementary school, rebuilding Wyndemere and bringing that up to code, and then addressing whatever is needed at center, and then building a new high school. So the most expensive one we'll talk about tonight, but we'll see what it does with the projected enrollments when we go this way. Starts to get us a little bit closer to where we need to be. So if we just stay at the existing, we'll see we're now trending much closer, so the amount of space we need to build by moving down to 5th grade comes down considerably. This gives us some flexibility in planning as to where that building might be and how you might approach getting your elementary capacity. 6 through 8 at the current high school comes right up to where we want to be in about 7 years. So not a bad fit for moving those guys over to here. Plus, you start to look at the educational opportunities. The high school science labs fit well with the middle school curriculum right now. They don't necessarily fit with a high school curriculum for science. The shop classes are pretty good. Gym is a little bit undersized. So perhaps we're better off thinking about moving the middle school up here. And that's one of the discussions that we're having as we move along. Now, approach 3. New high school and additions at all 3 of the elementary schools. So we'll stay where we are with the elementary schools. We'll increase to adjust to growth in the town. We'll keep the middle school moving over to the high school and build a new high school. This becomes our second most expensive approach because we're taking one new elementary school out of the mix. The unknown in this is what Wyndemere needs to come back up to code and be perfectly livable. Whether that's just renovating parts of it and adding to it or not is the next stage of this discussion as well. And then approach 4. Here we're looking at additions to all 5 of the existing buildings. So everything stays where it is, everything gets added to it. This we're projecting is about the 3rd most expensive approach. The dilemma with this that we'll be working through is how you work with this building. For as big as it is and as close to its property lines and other defining features, can you really work with this building to expand it and get the educational areas that you need within the constraints of actually running a building at the same time?
So as we look at the high school as a 912, there is a couple areas within it that we've identified. One at the back, one along the central spine area, as potential areas for exploration relative to consideration of providing that additional area that Greg is speaking to.
Now here you see if we take 6 through 8 at the current middle school, we're well over. High school runs just fine. We're looking at problems with where do you put 6 through 8? And how do you get 6 through 8 to work? It's a benefit to the elementary schools. It's a detriment to the middle school just in terms of facility. Whether we start to talk about it on the educational side is the ongoing discussion that we'll be moving through there. And 7, 8 at the high school makes a tough argument to move just 7th and 8th grade over to here. We're so far under the capacity that we start to look for community uses to take some of this building up. And if we move 6 through 8, you see that we come right up to where we want to be. So this is some of the data you develop as you start to figure out what might be possible with the middle school. And finally, we took approach 5, which is nothing matters and what if it did. If we completely blew apart your grade alignment and went a very more or less creative on pre-K through K, go townwide with pre-K and kindergarten, grades 1 and 2, grades 3 and 5. The schools we put them on right now are not necessarily the schools that they would best work at, but it's an approach that gives us some idea of what might you need for capacity and what might you be able to do. Ellington Middle School would move over to 850 students, stay right where it is and get an addition, and the high school would stay where it is and be adjusted to work from an educational point of view. The tough part on this one is in a town that's as spread out as you are with travel distances. Pre-K through K usually wants to be the anchor school, wants to be as close to your population center as possible because of the age of the kids. Your population centers are so spread that you're going to be looking at a tough on this one. But we want to make sure that it's explored to the point where there's an answer for it. If someone says, what are you going to do when pre-K comes along, if it comes along? Is there a thought about it? That's kind of the start at that one.
So we've referred to this alternative as approach as a parity option. By parity, every student within the system basically experiences a similar educational experience at each grade level. That's the positive side of it. Greg touched on one of the negatives, and that's because of the size of the community, the travel times on bus would probably be something that would be unacceptable. Another issue with this type of approach is also the number of breaks necessary as you move from grade level to grade level. So often seen as less desirable because of those transition points that are introduced into the early childhood education component of it.
So that brought us through to where we are tonight. Those are the options we've been looking at, the data we've been accumulating, and the idea of how could we start now to fit these into some potential test fits. Part of the difficulty of this is that we always need to be a couple steps ahead of the public presentation. So there's material we're developing and stuff we're talking about that might not make sense yet to you as we come through, but we're looking for feedback on the pieces of it that you do comprehend or do have a question about.
So what we'd like to do at this juncture, after having a chance to take a look at some of this information in advance, the brief introduction that we've offered along the way, if you might have any questions, concerns, issues that you'd like to touch on. I see Scott coming through.
Yeah, just a logistical thing. If you're watching on Local Live, what we're going to do when we record this, and you're not able to see some of the shots up here, we're going to make sure that when we record this, we're going to do some overlays on it so you're able to see things, okay? If you're not able to see everything right now, it's challenging to really get it blown up for you. We'll make sure you have all of these overlays in some form or fashion, okay? So just a logistical aspect there. If we do get questions from the audience, we'll try to move the mic over to you so your question can be heard nice and loud. Does that sound okay?
Thank you, Scott. So any questions to start us off this evening? Let me get a microphone to you.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what approach number one would look like logistically. You had some places blocked out where there would be the potential for, it looked like an addition, but then in approach one, I thought there wasn't going to be any buildings. So would that be portable classrooms? Would that be something else? Because we're over capacity in that scenario.
Okay. Paul, can you bring up approach one down below? So approach one, the goal is to keep the existing configuration. It's the schools as we know them, Wyndemere. But the difference, and hopefully I can manage this. I can get up to this right here. We're projecting out to 2028 with an enrollment projection. We're identifying that we're at about 107% capacity. Our target utilization's at about 90. And as we look across the elementary schools, Crystal Lake, Center, and Wyndemere, each of them exceeds their capacity as you're looking at those projections. As we look out to the middle school, we see similar utilization rates. The high school sits at 92%, so your overutilization target there as well. So what it really speaks to is some form of consideration relative to how do we deal with the population that's anticipated with the existing configuration that we have. At the high school, this example, some form of addition, and again, these are not meant to be architectural illustrations. They're really just a test fit scenario about how much square feet do we need and is there any possible opening for that within the site. That would be one example of how they might be tested. It could be a combination of renovate existing facility, reconfigure existing facility, possible addition necessary to address the utilization portion of it.
The way, there's a couple things going on here. We're working at 25, at this point, 25 students per classroom, which is over the town's desired student-teacher ratios. It's over the student-teacher ratios of virtually every town we work with. I kind of refer to these as the cat trying to get onto the table. You do a little drawing, you send it over to Brian and Scott, and they go, nope, that doesn't work. For whatever reason, the first ones we sent over on one of the schools. So it's just a quick idea of if we were to put that blue box there and it had no place to go, we'd know very early on before we're looking at more detail that the site's very difficult to work with, the site probably won't work. So more proof of concept than proof of anything.
So as we look back at this, what Greg was just referring to, the classroom loading that's identified at the top is this DAS guideline, 25 students per. As we look at this next chart, the green line represents loading at a desirable classroom loading. The red line speaks to a district considered maximum, and this purple dash line is that DAS guideline that's offered at 25 per. And you can see that, as we looked at the various charts, the variance that you have as you're thinking about it. So in terms of consideration of this, right now, those utilizations are tested against a pretty conservative consideration, which is the DAS consideration of loading at 25 students per. So it really does speak to anticipated need within the system, as we're looking forward with the projections that are in place. And again, from two demographers coming to consider it 1 year after each other, but collecting information in some ways in a very similar way, and then in others they look at things very differently in terms of how they collect the information, but coming to very similar, basically final conclusions. There will be a significant increase over time.
Part of the question was, would this solution include portable classrooms? And it would not be our recommendation to count on portable classrooms. They would be useful for a bulge that's going to go back down again, but the trend here is definitely up and staying up. So it should be solved with permanent construction.
Yes.
My question relates to enrollment projections, and perhaps it's not relevant, but perhaps changing world of school choice and magnet schools, kids leaving, other facilities are coming in. Does that come into play in your projections? And I know it's evolving, but I'm not.
Generally what you'll find is your approach to your curriculum and school offering will be a reflection of your enrollment, not the other way around. So being close enough to Hartford, you get kind of a distorted approach of the magnet schools because of the chef settlement. And so the magnet schools got to be an answer to a lot of that. We've used a magnet school approach intra-district, just within the district, to address racial diversity, free and reduced lunch disparities across the town. At this point, we're talking about maintaining or approaching it from a general curriculum point of view, not getting to that. It is a discussion that we've started to have with Brian and Scott, and we'll certainly keep it on the table.
If the question is also around, have the demographers weighed in on other forms of educational offerings, meaning are they drawing off significant portions of the student population? Was that part of the question?
Yep. So, yeah, and I can add, because I know that's a popular topic, but thank you. So the Project Choice program, those numbers are negligible. So if we weren't participating in it, or we are, any increase that we're in right now. The school is very difficult, right? So we have, this is one of the first years that we saw an actual decrease in our magnet school students that have been going out. So we've had some come back. We don't know if that's going to be a trend. It's very hard. People make their decision on an annual basis as to whether they're going to go to the magnet schools or not. But we were pretty much trending at about 130 students or so attending magnet schools. This year, we've seen some come back. We're going to watch that carefully to see if that continues, because if they continue to come back and it trends that way, hence the numbers continue to rise, and that's a very tricky thing.
Is it to our advantage to see that trend continue and to have those magnet schools come back? And is it to our advantage to keep the school and the capacity situation so that we attract them back?
Very difficult question to answer. What I would say to you is, because we're trending up with our student enrollment, if the magnet schools stay solid and kind of around where they are now, I think that will benefit us in the short term, especially because any building projects that happen, they're 4 or 5 years out, right? So we actually have this window time here where, depending on how quickly the enrollment increases, we could get into conversations about class sizes more and portables and those sorts of things while we're waiting to see what we're going to end up doing. So that's a challenge too. So if the magnet school numbers stay solid, I think that's going to benefit us. I think one of the things that people have to know is that when students from a magnet school go out, we pay for that, right? So we get a magnet school bill of around $300,000 every year. So part of the project choice, money comes in with that helps pay for any services those students need, all paid for by Hartford, and also is used to offset our magnet school bill, right? So that's very important. Those numbers, that financial aspect of things, project choice, magnet school, gets presented to the board in October. We already did a presentation, but we'll also talk a little bit more about it in February. So that's always an annual report that we give out to the board so they have an understanding of the kids moving in and out and the financials attached.
I see one back here.
I have a question about configuration 2. I don't know if we can bring that up. So is the suggestion to have, my understanding is that we would have 4 separate and distinct elementary schools under this proposal?
The way this is right now, it would be a 4th school. Where that's located or how it would function is the next step in the discussion. If we look at the way the town is growing, there's a well-founded argument that perhaps you need a school in the north central northwest corner to pick up that population up there and take some of the pressure off not only the building but the roadways between the northwest and Wyndemere. There are other approaches that would keep the sites that you have now and adjust how you do those buildings, what you put on those sites. Downside of a new building is the administrative and operational costs. The upside is the reduction in busing. So it's a step. The next step we'll take will be to explore those as upside downside.
So it seems like you're leaning that you wouldn't use the existing middle school as the 4th elementary school.
That's actually one that we've kept on the table for quite a while. Depending on if you take the middle school, put it here, put the high school somewhere else, then you can make a case that center school would serve more of the northern part of the town, and the middle school would serve more of central and south. There's a good bunch of population down center south as well that the middle school could serve quite easily. Downside of the middle school is size of classrooms and the arrangement of the building for an elementary school, not super conducive. Classroom sizes are a little bit small. It's a little bit of a concept that's sometimes hard to grasp. The smaller kids need bigger classrooms because they're in the classroom all day long. As you get up into the high school level, you can actually start to diminish the size of classrooms to reflect program. So you're building by program instead of people.
And what would your plan with Wyndemere be under this suggestion?
Wyndemere could go a couple of ways. It could be reduced in size and reduced in population. Most probably, well, either way you look at it, it's rebuilt or it's replaced on the site. Depends on where what we're calling here a new school would go. If it went down there and was somewhere on the west to the north side, then Wyndemere could get significantly smaller than it is now because it would have less population.
But you would place Wyndemere?
Most probably. It's a tough building the way it sits right now.
I can't see the capacity projections. They're so small up there. Can you?
Capacities on each one of these, the easy way to do
The
this
percentage.
Yeah, you've got about 1,200 students. If you're going to 4 schools, you would try to get that as close to even across all 4. So you'd talk about 300 students, 320 students in each one.
So what is that, like 72%? Is that what I'm seeing up there?
Right. At this point, if you keep Wyndemere the size it is now and reduce the enrollment, you'd be at 72%. So that's telling us now you could reduce the size of Wyndemere under this scheme.
Did you consider rebuilding Wyndemere from scratch and making it sized to, account for the population, but do it with 3 elementary schools, going to the 6 through 8 configuration?
I'm not sure I followed that one. Try me again.
Well, you're talking about building a fourth school. What if you rebuilt Wyndemere and just made it 2 stories large enough? Because we can decide what our districting is to adjust. I mean, we're not slicing the pie in 3 and just sending them to 3 schools. I mean, we can decide where students go.
You could,
Could you just accommodate a reasonable, usable percentage of students at 3 schools by replacing Wyndemere, which I think is a highly sought after option, big enough to accomplish that?
the straightforward answer is yes. The more complex answer is it's complex.
Okay.
Because the bigger the school gets, disproportionate to the other schools, the more its percentage of racial disparity to the other schools starts to grow. And you start to bounce up against that even now the way you are. And once you get there, you run into problems with the state. I'll turn that one to Scott, because it's a tough question.
Yeah, I think there's a state statute that essentially says you can't have a significant racial disparity between your schools. So if you made Wyndemere, and we may even face that without a building project. So if one particular school has a significant percent difference of minority population from, say, Wyndemere to Crystal Lake, what the state will say is you need to come up with a plan to address that, okay? Typically, what those plans involve is redistricting the school district, okay? Now, that is something that we've been trying to avoid. So the Board of Education, along with the administration, has been planning ahead. So if anyone knows anything about the school enrollment policy that we have, this allows new families coming in, new families. Everyone else is kind of grandfathered, but if you're coming into the district and you're new and you're registering, we are allowed to, if you live in the Wyndemere district, we're allowed to say, no, you're going to go to Center School or you're going to go to Crystal Lake. So just to give you an idea, this year was the first year we did that. 15 students that were supposed to be going to Wyndemere went up to Crystal Lake. Okay? So we're trying to create policy and plan ahead to avoid hit any of those benchmarks that the state puts in terms of the racial disparity. If you were to build a brand new huge Wyndemere school, right, that could exacerbate that problem. And one of the things we do know with the population is when people buy a home here and have been here and have been established, part of the reason they did so is to be in a particular school district area, right? And that's an understandable thing. I have children of my own, and we thought about that ourselves. We want to try to avoid the redistricting, right? So we're going to great lengths to try to figure that out. And so that's one of the considerations here.
And under this plan, Crystal Lake would not receive an addition?
As it is now, we're showing it as a potential, if need to be, to get it to balance. But as it is now, it has the capacity, we think, to serve that end of the town. So we're carrying it here
in this approach?
Yes. So we're carrying it with the potential to expand, if needed, as proof of concept. Could we expand that building if we absolutely needed to? Not sure.
We just spent $18 million on it.
What's that?
we just expanded it with an $18 million project.
Yep. Yes.
It's a little crazy. But.
If population drives it and it needs to be expanded, it would still qualify. If you took it offline or tried to decrease the size, the state would come back for grant money. So it becomes kind of one of the anchors in the elementary school discussion. Good building, well situated, well sized for that part of town.
I know we had a question up front here. Been answered. Perfect. There's one there, Greg.
Just to clarify, when I was looking at these and we see Wyndemere with addition, Wyndemere exists, I was thinking we're addressing capacity but not the aging of the structure. But I think when you answered Mr. York's question a little bit ago, are you confirming several of these actually include renovating Wyndemere? Absolutely. And is that included when you talk about relative cost, the need to renovate it?
What we'll take from this is renovation is always on the table. One reason, unless the state changes its funding scheme, there's more money for renovation than there is for new. So that's always a consideration. I like to drive all of those decisions based from an educational point of view. Are the rooms adequately sized? Is there the amenities that you need within the building? Can we get that to work for the benchmark school? So find out which school works best from an educational point of view and benchmark the other schools against that. Wyndemere right now, as a renovation project, when Jim and I were talking about it earlier, is probably going to be as close cost-wise to renovate as to replace. And so you probably make that site work better and the school work better by replacing it. That's one of the things we'll run to ground between now and January.
Replacing sort of embedded in some of these scenarios?
Yes.
Then, even though it says Wyndemere exists?
Yep. And the reason we always start with keep the existing is for swing space and functionality of the school. You don't have a place to put a bunch of kids if you take a school offline, and you don't want to rent modular units, temporary space, because you get no money back, no funding for those. It's money out the door when you're done. So we always start with the idea of let's keep all the space that you have functioning and work around it. And when we give that up, it's always reluctantly.
About 12 years ago, I think, there was like a bubble grade, like all of a sudden there was like a baby boom. And they had to work their way through the school system, and they had to be flexible with how that grade worked its way through. You're just projecting increases. You don't know where those numbers will be. I keep thinking of like a swing school, if you're going to build another building, and that would be like a relief valve for whatever grade or school is needing extra space. And then that space would be flexible within its use. That's my crazy idea, but.
It's a great question and point in terms of the need for flexibility to be able to meet those bubble grades as they move through the system. They always occur within districts. It's very unpredictable in terms of where you'll get that collection of third graders that then become fourth, fifth, sixth, and on. It's part of the reason why the utilization rates that are identified give some latitude. It's inevitable that these schools will have to negotiate those sorts of clusters as they move their way through the system. So that's part of the reason for the utilization rates being identified as they are, give that flexibility within the system for planning purposes. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any discussion as we look at possibly building a new high school of where that might go and how that might work out?
At this juncture, it was simply to be able to facilitate the consideration of the approach. There has been no identified available sites. There has been no identified consideration as to, where it might land. It's simply to be able to facilitate the conversation around if that was part of the approach, what would be the outcome? How would it move forward?
Is it possible for you to say anything about how this compares to a couple of the surrounding towns, perhaps, in terms of their enrollment and capacity? Maybe a strange thought, but okay, let's say we ball in and go for number 2 and have a great system with lots of capacity, and somebody's looking to move to the area, and they're looking at Ellington and South Windsor, and they go, oh, Ellington has got this wonderful new space with lots of capacity, let's go to there, and then we end up in a worse trend line than what we're thinking about. So are we on, if we did some of these, are we on par with neighbors, or are we doing better than them or worse than them?
Well, in terms of on par, better or worse, South Windsor is addressing it from their elementary schools up. They have a very well laid out approach to their elementary schools and replacing them and renewing them as they go. Windsor is doing essentially the same. Further south, Glastonbury did it a few years ago and has maintained the system pretty similar to that. Part of anticipating the growth is, as Jim said, the utilization rates. If you look across 1,200 student capacity at the elementary schools at 90% utilization, gives you capacity for 120 students in pre-K through 5. So you've got quite a bit of leeway there. Other advantages, each one of the if you design from new, you would design for expansion. So you would size the building to accommodate a few more classrooms, another wing of classrooms, not build into the site such a way that you couldn't expand it. So you've got the capacity to anticipate it. I don't know that we'll ever see the amount of boom and bust that we saw in baby boom, which is what we're essentially dealing with now. Everything that was built when we were all growing up has now exceeded its lifespan and is bigger or misplaced based on the populations we have now.
In general, we're trending demographically more like South Windsor. So we're trending more demographically like South Windsor, which is seeing an increase back up. South Windsor has a well-articulated 10-year facilities master plan that they're implementing with many different projects going on at once. To show you how inexact the science this is and really difficult is they built one new school and all of a sudden their projections of enrollment are exceeding some of that. So it's challenging. It's unusual, but it's challenging. Most of the other towns in the area are all decreasing. So Ellington is kind of like folded in with South Windsor in terms of folks moving here and development happening. South Windsor is a very different town. I'm not trying to compare the towns. They have a much different tax base. They have a much different layout. However, there are some similarities in the demographics.
Anyone
Any
else?
other questions?
Do these options go into enough detail to address what we talked about at the last meeting in terms of 21st century classroom spaces, open spaces, flexible spaces, very different from sort of the classroom, boxy classrooms we have now? Is that incorporated in this yet?
I can start the response to that, and it's certainly not in terms of what's depicted here to demonstrate it. But from a planning standpoint, yes. The planning standpoint in terms of do we have the correct utilization rate applied to the building? Do we have consideration of what's the classroom loading? And are we at the DAS standard or are we at a more reasonable standard for loading of classrooms? So that kind of consideration is baked in. But a good amount of work still is ahead of us. As we start to winnow these options down, or these approaches down, and start to look at more specifics within a particular approach, a question might be, well, there's one alternative which does these three things. There'll be another that still fits under the same category, but approaches it slightly differently. And that type of kind of fine-tuning has not occurred as of yet. That's still work ahead of us as we move forward.
And that's part of what John was after and working with the teachers, the administrators, and where do you see education 10 years from now? Where do you think you need to do in order to get there, and what kind of spaces do you need? So we'll be looking at that as we move into between now and the next time we're back.
Just a fairly minor question. Early on you mentioned the central office building is, I guess, already over capacity, and I know that obviously the town hall needs expansion as well. Is any thought of combining those two, or?
Well, the question always is when you start down a line like this, you want to look at everything that might need to be addressed, and then what it might cost to own anything you might take offline. So when we started talking with Scott's crew, it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that if you're taking classroom space out of the school that's across the driveway, you got a problem. And so we need to find a place for the central admin. You'll see in all of the ideas where there's either excess space at the high school or the middle school, we've identified it as potential central office location. Central office functions are a little bit easier to fit into a building that was built with smaller classrooms because you're essentially just making offices out of it. So it will land within the options eventually. That space will land somewhere.
And I wanted to mention, we've also met with Parks and Rec and Youth Services, right? So if you're thinking about a space like, theoretically, if the current middle school is vacant because you move it over to the high school, right? and you put in there, say, Board of Education, right? Offices, that library becomes a quasi, Board of Education room, right, for meetings. You could easily take pre-K and have it just there, right? You could also take any sort of, like, we have a variety of programs. If you've been over at Dragon, you see we have a building there, a couple of programs housed there. Those programs could come out of there and be sectioned off in a particular area or on a particular floor. There's the opportunity to possibly create like various autistic programs or different things for kids to kind of keep them in district, which is important because you want all your children connected to the school district and the community, right? So you have that option. Then you start to think about, okay, well, if there's space in that building, right? Because it's a big building. Okay, could Park and Rec be there? All of a sudden there's another gymnasium facility there. Could the Youth and Service Bureau? We have youth services. This is amazing. They just do a great job, and so does in Parks and Rec. Youth services is in our buildings all the time. So we already have that connection. So if we can create like a full service community center / Board of Education where parents are coming in for pre-K, they can actually possibly take some classes and different things with youth services or Parks and Rec. You have Board of Education there, and it's a full service. That would be good for the town, right? So trying to think about it as this is a town developing, right? It's a challenge, but these are great challenges for the town to undertake, right? Tough decisions that the citizens of Ellington have to just decide what direction they want to go. But we can't just think about the families of the students attending schools. We have to be thinking about all of the citizens and how any of the monies and taxpayers' money are spent are going to benefit as many people as we possibly can. I think that's one of the points of emphasis that needs to continue to have conversation.
And I know there was another question over there. I'm going to ask this side just to play catch up. They're out questioning us tonight. Anybody over here? Greg, do you want to take it up to that other individual?
I think you mentioned one approach being more expensive than the other. Do you have any numbers to show how different the four approaches are? Or is there any ballpark figure for each of these? Thank you.
I'm going to let Greg hit that. He was on top of it.
Your question was?
Is there any numbers?
No.
Of how expensive one
At this point, no. It would be virtually impossible without the further refinement and development of a better program for each one of the buildings to do that.
And I think the other thing to be thinking about and I think it's complex when you think about the finances as a town and how it all works. There's reimbursement rates from the state, whether it's new or renovated. There's even, depending on your situation with I talked about the racial imbalance. There's also different reimbursement rates for that. So if your project plan is going to be addressing that, sometimes you can get some more reimbursement from the state. What the town eventually will have to look at is you obviously have a debt service. So there's been building projects in the past. Those are bonded out over 20 years. Where's the money? What can the town take on additional debt? And what does that look like in terms of the bond rating for the town and the financial security of the town? So it's pretty complex. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be for all of the citizens, right, is you can say a number and then people go, wow, that's a big number, or we can't afford that, or we can't afford that. It's not a black and white answer like that. You have to look at a variety of different factors. What is actually going to be the impact on the taxpayers, for the average taxpayers per year for the next 20 years? And you have to try to get to that point eventually, which throwing out numbers now would be very premature. And what we want to make sure with this entire process is we do not want to mislead the public, right? They have a amount of time that they can to do all of this work. So when we can get firm and educate them on all these things, then we can slowly build that up so they can be well informed, have the right info, and then make the decisions that they will make.
Part of my task is to play timekeeper. We've given you an agenda to try to say we're going to respect your time and get out of here on time. I know there was another couple questions there. We have about 2 minutes until we get to quarter after. Does anybody want to share those?
Yes, I was wondering if in your demographic reports that you looked at the amount of seniors in the town and the ones that live in their homes and the possible turnovers of those homes, because in my neighborhood especially, there's people surrounding me that are all just about giving up as far as trying to keep the lawns up and everything. And
Sure.
They're getting older. Nobody's getting any younger. And I just wonder if that comes into play too, because I see a lot of seniors at the senior center, a lot more than I've had in the past. And a lot of them are looking at, other things, not the Ivy yet, but, there's a lot of them moving over to the place, the smaller homes where they upkeep everything,
Sure.
and you just live there,
Well, it's a great observation and a great question in terms of, is that baked into the demographer's consideration? The answer is yes. NESDEC and ERM take into consideration population in terms of its trend, population in terms of household ownership, consideration of what's the probability of turnover of those housing units moving forward. Because a house that's been occupied for the last 30 or 40 years that may have had a family move through it in terms of those using the school systems, but hasn't had a student in the system for maybe 15 or 20 years, they're great homes for young families. They're perfect places for young families to come in with 2 or 3 students. And it is a consideration that our demographers are keeping a close eye on in terms of moving forward. So thank you for that question. I'll use that as our last question for this evening. However, I'd like to say, Greg, John, Paul, myself, we will stay around afterwards. We're happy to continue the conversation, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time in terms of moving forward. So as we're coming down to the end of the evening here, we wanted to have an opportunity to ask an exit question, if you will. We're going to have sticky notes, yellow, green, and blue. Yep, there we go, yellow, green, and blue sticky notes. We'll have to spread them out so people can get at them easily. But what we'd like to ask you to do, we want to ask a question through 3 different lenses, and we want you to self-select how you want us to hear your response. If you're most interested in issues around education, educational outcomes, if you would use a yellow sticky note for educational response, we'd like that. If your concerns or issues or long-term considerations fall into the category of facilities, we'd ask you to use a blue sticky note. And then lastly, if overall community outcome is most important to you, if we could ask you to use a green sticky note. Once you've determined your color, again, yellow will be education, blue will be facility, green will be community. We'd like to ask you to look at the 6 approaches that have been identified, and if you could offer for us which of the approaches seems to have most resonance with you. Most importantly, if you could jot just a few lines of why, what issue, what concern, what outcome is most important, that would be very helpful for our team. And what I'll do is, Paul, you have 2 arms. I will not put anything in Greg's hands this evening. We're going to give Paul green. Paul is going to be our community, if anybody wants to answer that question through the lens of community. Blue and yellow? Rebecca has yellow. So that's the educational lens. And then lastly, the blue will be abilities, and they will be here. And again, the question that's being posed is, which of these approaches for you resonates most? If no option resonates, that's a fair response. Please record that, share what might or what alteration might help us in terms of thinking about it and moving forward. And before we get to that exercise, I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
Yeah, and I'm
Already
assuming,
loaded.
Jim, that once they do that exit tick, they're going to do it and walk out. So I just want to make some concluding remarks. We have some of our elected officials here. I want to thank them for coming out. Our first selectman, Lori Spielman, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. Tracy Kipp Judson's our chair of the Board of Education. Gary Blanchett, a 20-plus year Board of Education member. Remember, these Board of Ed members, this is all volunteerism. They don't get paid for this. I see Liz Nord here, Board of Education chair member. Melinda Ferry on the Board of Selectmen. I see Doug Harding here from the Board of Finance. Jack Turner from the Board of Selectmen also. I don't think I'm missing anyone. Remember, Carrie Sosha, way back there from the Board of Education. Thanks for coming, Carrie. And I want to remind everyone that we do have an advisory group that we run this through before we come out to the workshops. Okay, so Gary Blanchett's on that, Tracy Kipp Judson's on that, Carrie Sosha is on that, Jack Turner is on that, Doug Harding is on that, Peter Welty, he's chair of the Permanent Building Committee, he is on that, and we have several administrators. So we're involving all of the folks that are representing the key boards so that they are part of the conversations. One of the next steps in this process is January 17th, where we'll be back here to look at things narrowed down a great deal. But this is a process, folks. It takes time. Eventually, the Board of Education will have to make a determination based on the master plan of what they want to do. So even if the Board of Education approves something that they want to move forward, there's a whole host of town processes that it has to go through. So we're at the kind of the beginning of this process. What we're going to make sure that we do is the website, we're developing it out. So I'm going to make sure that all of these approaches, you're able to access them. You can click on them and look at them, right? We're going to make sure that we have the video up and the overlays, and we'll continue to put down information, and eventually we'll get a frequently asked question, and we'll kind of continuously develop it out. So if people are confused, if you're hearing rumors on social media, what you got to do is go to the website, take a look at it. If you can't find the answer there, contact me, and we'll answer your questions. We want people to be informed so they can make a well-educated decision on how they want this town to evolve. Folks, this is over the next 20 to 30 years we're talking about here. This is important stuff, and it's your town, right? So it's a very exciting time for the Ellington Public Schools in the town of Ellington. We appreciate you coming out. Please do write a question on any of the stickies, because that'll help us. We'll collate all that together, and that will drive some of the next discussions. So appreciate very much for coming out, and have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful holiday season. And yes? What is the January again? So the January 17th meeting is more of this, very much narrowed down of what the actual master plan is at this point, of what the study resulted in. Doesn't mean it's set in stone. The Board of Education still has to be considering that and having discussions. There could be a host of different approaches that the board says, well, here's what this says. We're going to go in this direction, or this direction. So that's going to take some time. Okay, thanks, folks, for coming out.
So as you write out your response, if you can just attach it to the board, which is your preferred alternative or approach.